A palm rests against the wall. Fingers spread wide, pressed hard enough to leave blood behind. That print will remain on file for 23 years. Detectives will photograph it, catalog it, and compare it against neighbors, friends, and everyone connected to the house. It will not match a single one of them. Nobody investigating this case in 1989 could have imagined who would eventually solve it. Not a homicide detective, not a forensic specialist. A police officer who had never worked a murder investigation would be the one to look at that print again and see what everyone else had missed. But that comes later. First, there is a 16-year-old girl who deserves to be remembered for more than the print left behind on her bedroom wall. Today's case is the murder of Amy Weidner. On paper, the house on the south side of Indianapolis looked like a family that had already survived its hardest chapter. A single mother, 4 children, a divorce behind them, bills paid one at a time. By every ordinary measure, the difficult part was supposed to be over. Gloria Weidner had done what so many parents do after a marriage ends. She rebuilt, she worked, she kept her children fed, in school, and together under one roof. And somewhere inside that rebuilt life, her second oldest child had quietly become the one thing every struggling family hopes for, the success story, the one who was not going to need saving. That is the contradiction sitting underneath everything that happened to Amy Weidner. The people who knew her would have told you, without hesitation, that she was the kind of teenager parents pointed to as proof that things could still turn out fine. Honor roll, involved in clubs, a hard worker, according to the one teacher who spoke about her years later. Someone whose defining trait was simply how much effort she put into everything she touched. On the surface, Amy's life looked settled. Underneath it, she was already carrying something none of those teachers or classmates knew anything about. But before any of that, there was simply a girl going to school. Amy attended Howe High School on the east side of Indianapolis, and in the mid-1980s, walking through those hallways, she would have looked like any other student. A teenager, balancing homework and friendships and whatever ordinary teenage worries filled her days. Her French teacher, Jody George, remembered her plainly, the way teachers remember the students who simply do the work without needing to be asked twice. Amy was not the loudest personality in the room. She was the reliable one, the one who showed up, the daughter adults stopped worrying about. At home, life moved at the pace every busy household moves at. Gloria worked full-time to support 4 children on her own. Amy's older brother, JP, was around the age where friends started coming and going from the house more often, the way it happens in every family with a teenage son. Nobody thought much of it. Friends dropped by. Some stayed for dinner. Some sat around talking while the younger kids did homework in another room. It was unremarkable, the kind of background noise every family with teenagers learns to live with. No one in that house had any reason, in those years, to look twice at any of it. Underneath that ordinary rhythm, though, a crack had already formed, one small enough that it stayed hidden for months. At 13 years old, Amy discovered she was pregnant. She did not tell her mother, not right away. For nearly 5 months, she hid it, wearing baggy sweatshirts, and going about her days as though nothing had changed. It was a secret most adults would have struggled to keep quiet, for even a few weeks. The father was 17, a friend of JP's named Tony Abercrombie. When Amy finally told Gloria the truth, there was no undoing what had already happened. There was only the question of what the family did next. What they did was, in its own way, remarkable. Gloria did not turn her daughter's life upside down. On October 25, 1987, Amy gave birth to a daughter she named Emily. And then, 6 days later, Amy went back to school. Not 6 weeks. 6 days. For the next 2 years, she lived 2 full lives, stitched into one. She fed a baby before catching the bus in the morning. She studied for exams after Emily had gone to sleep. She kept her grades high enough to stay on the honor roll while raising a toddler almost entirely alone, with Gloria helping wherever she could fit it in around her job. Amy was not interested in being defined by what had happened to her at 13. She wanted, more than almost anything, to finish school and build something better for her daughter. By the time November of 1989 arrived, Amy was 16, Emily was 2, and the household had settled into a rhythm that, on the surface, looked almost entirely ordinary again. On the morning of November 13th, that ordinary rhythm played out exactly the way it always did, until it did not. Amy woke up feeling unwell. It was the kind of decision teenagers make without a second thought. She stayed home from school. Emily, too young for daycare, stayed home with her mother, the way she often did. The rest of the household moved through its usual morning. Gloria left for work. JP and the younger girls went about their routines. By mid-morning, the house had emptied out the way houses do on weekday mornings across the entire country, leaving behind just a sick 16-year-old and her 2-year-old daughter. Nothing about that morning should have been dangerous. Nothing about staying home sick with a toddler should have required a second thought from anyone. And yet, at some point that day, everything in that house changed. Gloria tried to check in on her daughter, the way mothers do when they leave a sick child at home. She called the house. The phone rang, and no one picked up. On its own, that is rarely alarming. Teenagers do not always answer the phone. Sick kids sometimes sleep through calls. Gloria could have waited it out, told herself Amy was resting, tried again in an hour. Instead, something about the silence did not sit right with her. She asked a neighbor to walk over and knock on the door, hoping a knock might succeed where the phone had not. The neighbor tried the door. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. No 2-year-old crying in the background. The sound that fills almost every house with a toddler in it. Just a closed door, and a house that gave absolutely nothing away. Gloria made the decision to go home herself. What waited for her inside that house is the kind of moment no parent should ever have to describe out loud. Amy was in her bedroom, and she was dead. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Somewhere else in that same house, Emily was found, physically unharmed, 2 years old, too young to understand what had happened just rooms away from her. The daughter Amy had fought so hard to raise, the daughter she had missed only 6 days of school for, was now growing up without the mother who had built her entire teenage life around Emily. Investigators moving through that bedroom found one detail that seemed almost immediately like the piece of evidence that would break the case wide open. Pressed into the wall was a bloody handprint, left behind with enough force and enough blood to create a nearly complete impression. To the detectives working the scene, it looked like exactly the kind of evidence that solves a case within days, not decades. It did not work out that way. Investigators built their early theory around a reasonable assumption that whoever did this was someone Amy knew, or at least someone connected to the household. They pulled hair samples and fingerprints from neighbors. They pulled them from friends of JP's, reasoning that someone close to her brother might have known the house, might have known Amy would be home sick that day. One by one, those samples were compared against the print on the wall. One by one, none of them matched. That is where the first real question of this case takes shape, and it is one that would not get answered for 23 years. If the killer left behind something as specific as a full palm print, why did every obvious name in Amy's life come back clean? The investigation did not simply stall. It became something closer to a slow erosion. Lieutenant Roger Spurgeon, who at the time led the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department's cold case unit, later admitted just how difficult it was to even narrow the case down to likely suspects. There were leads. None of them held. Eventually, Spurgeon moved to a different assignment, the way officers often do when a case simply refuses to move forward with them. While detectives worked through a list of names that kept coming back empty, Gloria was left to rebuild a household around an absence. She could not bring Amy back. What she could do was make sure Emily grew up surrounded by the people who had loved her mother most. Gloria formally adopted her granddaughter, the little girl who had been born when Amy was only 13 years old. The little girl Amy had fought to raise while still finishing high school herself would now be raised by Amy's own mother. A daughter became a granddaughter in the eyes of the law. Then a granddaughter became a daughter again. Years passed the way they do after a case goes quiet. Not all at once, but in a long, uneven fade. Files do not disappear inside a police department. They get boxed, moved to storage, reassigned, revisited only when someone finally has the time or the reason to pull them back out. For most of the 1990s, and well into the 2000s, nobody had either. The palm print stayed exactly where it had always been, sitting inside an evidence file, waiting for a comparison that had not been run yet. Somewhere in Indianapolis, during all those years, the person who left that print was simply living, working, existing, likely never once considering that a piece of himself was still sitting inside a file cabinet, waiting for the right person to look at it again. 23 years is long enough for a 2-year-old to become a young woman with almost no memory of the mother she lost. It is long enough for the detectives who first walked into that bedroom to retire, or transfer, or simply move on to cases that still had momentum. It is long enough for a mother to keep asking the same question at the start of every year that passes without an arrest. Not whether the case would ever be solved, whether she would still be alive to see it if it was. For Gloria and her family, the not knowing was never really the hardest part. They knew what had happened to Amy, in painful, specific detail. What they did not have was a name. There is a particular kind of anger that comes from that gap, from knowing evidence exists, knowing a killer's exact handprint is sitting in a folder somewhere, and still watching year after year pass without anyone able to say who it belonged to. It is the anger of knowing that justice is technically still possible, while feeling, with every passing year, like it might never actually arrive. That was where the case stood for over 2 decades. A palm print with no name, a family with no answers, a little girl growing up on the other side of a tragedy she was too young to remember, raised by a grandmother who had quietly become her mother. Nobody in that house on the south side of Indianapolis could have guessed what it would eventually take to change any of it. Not a new piece of forensic technology, not a breakthrough at the crime lab. It would take something far stranger than that, something that had nothing to do with police work at all, and everything to do with a photograph, a Facebook page, and an officer who had never worked a homicide in his life. For over 20 years, nothing about Amy Weidner's case looked like it was moving. And then, in an odd twist, the thing that finally moved it was not a breakthrough in forensic science at all. It was a Facebook page. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of how this case finally broke open. Cold cases are supposed to get solved by new DNA technology, by advanced labs, by detectives trained specifically to reopen decades-old files. Amy's case was, for a while, solved by none of those things. It was solved because a friend missed her, and because one police officer happened to be the person asked to print out some photographs. Life for the Weidner family by 2011 had folded around the absence the way families eventually learned to. Emily, found unharmed in that house back in 1989, was no longer a toddler. She was a young woman, raised by her grandmother, carrying a version of her mother built almost entirely out of other people's memories, and a handful of photographs. Gloria had spent over 2 decades running a household that never stopped being shaped by what happened in that bedroom. Even as everyone in it grew older, moved through school, built ordinary lives on top of an extraordinary loss. Then, quietly, a small crack opened in a case that had not moved in years. A friend of Amy's created a memorial page on Facebook called Remembering Amy Weidner, after a local newspaper article revived some public interest in the unsolved case. It was a small, ordinary gesture, the kind of thing people do for someone they have not forgotten. Nobody creating that page had any idea it would eventually matter to the investigation at all. The cold case detective assigned to Amy's file was not particularly familiar with Facebook. That, on its own, is an unremarkable detail. But it meant that when someone in the department needed help printing photos off the memorial page, they turned to a colleague instead, a nuisance abatement officer named William Carter, someone who spent his days on property violations and neighborhood complaints, not homicide investigations. Carter had never worked a murder case in his career. His days were built around code complaints and neighborhood disputes, the kind of low-level nuisance work that rarely puts an officer anywhere near a homicide file. There was no obvious reason he should have been the one to change anything about Amy's case. He was not assigned to it. Nobody asked him to solve it. He was simply the person standing nearest to a printer. What happened next is the part of this story that resists easy explanation. Carter printed the photos he had been asked for. And then, instead of walking away, he kept reading. He pulled the case file. He looked at pictures of a 16-year-old honor roll student who had spent her last 2 years of life raising a toddler while finishing high school. Something about it did not let him go. He started working the case on his own time, outside of his actual job description, digging through decades-old paperwork that technically belonged to someone else's desk. There is no clean explanation for why one case reaches a person and another does not. Carter had likely walked past hundreds of old files in his years with the department. This was the one that stayed with him. Whatever it was, curiosity, obligation, something harder to name, it was enough to pull a man with no homicide background into a 23-year-old mystery that trained detectives had already set down. Carter did not do this alone for long. He teamed up with fellow IMPD Sergeant David Ellison, and together the two of them began re-interviewing witnesses and re-examining evidence that had been sitting untouched since the investigation first went cold. They were not chasing a new lead so much as they were asking old questions again, hoping that enough time and enough fresh eyes might turn up something everyone before them had missed. It did. Somewhere in that renewed process, investigators compared the palm print lifted from Amy's bedroom wall back in 1989 against a print sitting in an entirely unrelated file, one taken during a routine arrest in 1997. It matched. The name attached to that print was Rodney Denk. For a case that had spent 23 years circling around people connected to Amy's brother, J.P., the name landed with a particular kind of weight. Denk was not a stranger. He was a family friend, a former classmate of J.P.'s, someone who had likely been in and out of that house the same unremarkable way any of J.P.'s other friends had been. He was exactly the kind of name investigators had been hoping to rule in, or rule out, back in 1989. Instead, he had spent over 2 decades never once coming up as a serious suspect. That raises its own uncomfortable question. If Denk had been close enough to the family to be considered a friend, how did he manage to avoid suspicion for so long, while so many others connected to JP had their prints and samples pulled and cleared? In July of 2012, the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, under Terry Curry, filed charges against Denk. He was 40 years old by then, a grown man with a life built on top of whatever happened in that bedroom decades earlier. At the time of the murder, he had been 18. According to Denk's own account, the day had started as a burglary, not a planned attack. He said he broke into the house on the south side of Indianapolis, intending to steal a stereo, believing the house would be empty on a weekday morning. Instead, he found Amy home sick with her daughter. When she confronted him, Denk said he panicked. That panic turned into the beating, the sexual assault, and the strangling that took Amy's life somewhere in that house, with her own 2-year-old daughter nearby. A robbery that was never supposed to involve anyone at all ended with a 16-year-old dead and a toddler left to grow up without her mother. For 23 years, that toddler's family had wondered whether the person responsible even remembered what he had done, whether he had gone on to build an ordinary life, a job, a family of his own, while carrying the one detail that could undo all of it. As it turned out, he had. On May 30th, 2013, Denk signed a plea agreement. The following month, in June of 2013, he was sentenced in Marion Superior Court to 65 years in prison, just before the case would have gone to trial. There would be no trial for the Weidner family to sit through, no drawn-out cross-examination forcing them to relive the details in front of a jury. There would only be a plea, a sentence, and a name finally attached to a print that had waited 23 years to mean something. For the Weidner family, that sentencing should have closed the story. In most cases like this, it would have. But this case had one more thing waiting, the kind of detail that makes an already difficult story almost impossible to fully process. Rodney Denk had a son named Dylan. And by the time Rodney was sentenced for killing Amy, Dylan was already serving 20 years in prison of his own. For killing his mother, Mary McHenry, Rodney's ex-wife. Dylan had been 16 years old when he did it. 1 year younger than his father had been when he killed Amy. 2 generations of the same family, each responsible for taking the life of a woman, each doing it as a teenager barely out of childhood himself. Nobody investigating Amy's case in 1989 could have imagined that detail waiting on the other end of it. It is the kind of coincidence that makes you wonder less about resolution and more about what, exactly, passed down inside that family, and whether anyone could have seen it coming. Dylan's case was its own tragedy, separate from Amy's, carrying its own set of circumstances that led a 16-year-old to kill his mother. But sitting next to Rodney's case, it becomes almost impossible not to notice the pattern. A father capable of the violence that ended Amy's life. A son, 1 year younger than his father had been, capable of ending his own mother's life in turn. 2 women dead, decades apart, at the hands of 2 generations of the same household. No investigator, no prosecutor, no journalist covering either case could offer a clean explanation for that. Some details in a story simply refuse to resolve into something that makes sense. Amy Weidner, meanwhile, was left to carry a version of closure that never quite feels complete. She grew up under her grandmother's roof, raised as a daughter rather than a granddaughter, surrounded by people who loved her mother and rarely stopped grieving her. She went on to graduate from Purdue University, eventually moving to California, building a life at a distance from the house where everything happened. She was too young, at 2 years old, to remember her mother directly. Everything she knows about Amy comes from other people, from photographs, from a case file that spent 23 years defining her family before anyone finally attached a name to it. Emily has said, in the years since, that she wonders what her mother would have been like today. Whether she would have gone to college, what she would have done with her life. She imagines that she and her mother would have been friends, not just parent and child, if given the chance neither of them ever got. That is the part of this story that outlasts the courtroom. Rodney Denk is serving 65 years. The palm print that waited 23 years finally has a name attached to it. But none of that changes what Emily lost, or gives her back the mother she was too young to remember. Somewhere in California, a young woman who was once a 2-year-old, left unharmed in that bedroom, still carries a question that no conviction can fully answer. Not who did this to her mother. She knows that now. The question that remains is who her mother might have become, and who they might have been to each other, if a single ordinary Monday in November of 1989 had gone even slightly differently. If you stayed with us until the end, thank you for watching. If you enjoy well-researched true crime stories like this, consider subscribing to Just Crime Talks. It really helps the channel. And before you go, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to see how many places this story reached.